You doing good?
I'm doing good.
All right. Just making sure.
I'm doing good. It's a lot going on, but I'm doing good. Mostly I'm just glad our kids were out of town last week and my wife was in Ireland. And so
Oh, yeah, that's right. She came back in, flew in last night.
Last
Did you
night,
get your laundry
yeah.
done?
I got it all done. Yeah, it was great. I mean, she was in the air and traveling for like 20 hours. Her time. I mean, her cumulative of all of it because she...
That's still a lot of time
I
on
know
an
it was
airplane.
rough. Well, and she told me she was like, I asked her if she slept on the planes, and she said no. I didn't want to like sleep too much, and then when I got here, I couldn't go to sleep because she gained all these hours like coming this way. When you're flying west, so she took off at like noon, not at noon. She took off at like maybe it was noon her time. She took off at noon Ireland time and landed at like 1:00 in Chicago. After an 8-hour flight, because you gain that many hours coming this way. So anyway, she left. She finally got back to the house last night at like 11 p.m., I think. Her flight from Chicago was delayed. I think she walked through the door around 11 p.m., but she left at like 6 a.m. our time. So it was a long time. So anyways, she like walked in the door and just like collapsed into the bed and went to sleep. So anyway, it is nice that just to kind of have everybody back, and 2 weeks until school starts, just kind of getting back into the rhythm. So, but last week was good because everybody was out of town and I got a lot done. But
There you go.
It was also weird. Came home and it was just quiet and
You know, you got
bizarre.
to take those moments where you can get them and try and enjoy them. And then the rest of your life is just chaotic noise.
Yeah. It is dramatic how different the noise level is in our home, depending on if our kids are there, how many of our kids are there. Yeah, it really is crazy. But
Well, welcome to Sunday Plus. Today we are expanding on, if you didn't watch the sermon, go watch it. And we're expanding on Esther.
on Esther.
On Esther. As I mentioned yesterday, one of only 2 books in the Bible named after a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that, do you think? I mean, there's an obvious answer.
Yeah. Well, I would say primarily one caveat to this is that very few books in the Bible are named after a person unless they were a prophet. So I made a joke in this sermon that like David, there's no book of David, there's no book of Paul. Paul wrote most of those letters, and so he's probably not going to name them after himself. But there's no book of Moses, even though Moses, is attributed to being the author of several in the beginning. So some of it is just a lot of books aren't named after people, but predominantly it's mostly because, the culture and society at the time was extremely patriarchal, and women... And I'm not an expert in any of this, and it changes dramatically depending on when you're talking about. If you're talking about during the time of Moses versus during the time of Paul, there's thousands of years that have changed in there, and cultures are different. But predominantly, nobody would have been literate in the midst of all that, but especially not women. And women couldn't own land. Marriages were not really based on love as much as deals between families in the midst of that. So this is where you have a lot of that like dowry culture, and it's just tough in the midst of that for a modern American mind where we're so focused on individualism and equal rights and, dual working households and all of that.
Well, even then, I remember a time where that wasn't nearly as much the case.
Sure, yeah.
And, social media and things like that have shone a spotlight on that kind of, just inconsistency between, equal pay and, women being treated different in the workplace, and, subservient wife versus independent wife, and all these things that I just do not have recollection of that being a topic of conversation growing up. And then almost it felt like overnight you have the Me Too movement, and then social media is like really pushing for equal pay and all these things. So it really felt like it was almost an overnight thing that people even consistently thought about women in the workplace or women's rights or anything like that. I'm sure
Yeah.
women were thinking about it for
Well,
the entire
yeah, I
time.
mean, and social media, social movements ebb and flow, and a lot of what we've seen, the advent and the prevalence of social media and 24-hour news and the internet is how connected we are in the world today. Somebody said it really well, where when all this first started really becoming prevalent and we were getting updates on our phone and we would get breaking news alerts constantly, is people had this impression that, things are getting worse and the world is getting so much darker. And I remember the first time I heard this, it was a big aha moment for me, is that it's not that things were necessarily getting worse. It's that we were just aware of so many more things now. Whereas before, you'd hear your local news, but you wouldn't hear about something that happened in, Sarasota, Florida, or it was something that's all the way across the country or across the world. You were far less likely to hear about those things. Well,
Sure.
with social media and the way that everything works now, it is so much more prevalent. So that's part of the conversation. But I mean, getting back to Esther, part of it too is, I say all that to say, you do see women in scripture, but because they weren't in these roles of being, rabbis and leaders in that way, the King David and King Solomon, you've got a lot of these leaders who are all typically men. And so, as within most histories, you're going to be talking about the leaders in those movements. Now, if you do read through, like in the time of the judges, which is when they return to the promised land, if they leave Egypt, before they establish the kingdom, so before David comes along, which is this sermon, this Sunday, we're talking about all that.
Hey.
But there's a time when they live in what they called a tribal federation. It's all the 12 tribes of Israel living together, but they kind of agreed to work together, but there was no single ruler over all of them. And so when a problem came up, God would appoint a judge. And that's what the book of Judges is it's these leaders that God would rise up to solve the problem. And then they would usually, it's because numbers are all symbolic in scripture, not all, but usually symbolic in scripture. And so there'd be 40 years of peace after that, after almost every judge.
Yeah, we were talking about that last podcast, how it always felt like it's these round numbers, but that's verbal.
They're there for a
history.
reason. Yeah.
And where it's like, it was 3,000, it was 5,000, it was 7,000.
It's like 144,000. It's like, that's really specific.
Yeah, it's very round number, but specific.
But not So all to say, you see, like Deborah is one of the judges. So you do see women in some of these positions, but typically culturally, you're going to see a lot of women in scripture showing up, sort of not in these appointed public leadership roles. But especially if you look in the New Testament church, I mean, you see women all around. I mean, it's the women who are the first to the tomb who then take the news back. And so whenever we celebrate, women's ordination in the Methodist Church, we always talk about how if it weren't for women preachers, nobody would have heard about the resurrection, because it's only women who go to the tomb.
Yeah.
So you hear that, you see Phoebe taking the gospel to Rome, and Paul kind of empowering her to go do that. And you see women all throughout. It's just they're not usually in those prime elected or kind of whatever leadership roles.
Sure.
So they don't usually get a lot of airtime, but they're constantly there. You just have to kind of know how to parse that out for the cultural reality and how histories were written at the time.
So alongside this, you mentioned something that I love when I get reminded about this, because you grow up seeing so many depictions of biblical characters, which are predominantly men, but they always have these big scraggly beards,
Sure.
and there's always like hints of white in there, and they just all look rough dudes. And I get it was a rougher time, but they're all like clearly in their 40s or 50s or 60s. And the thing that you brought up that, and every time just snaps, so these were, for the most part, a lot of this time, these were kids, teenagers.
Yeah.
These were teenagers.
Yeah.
And so like, I was writing down, Esther, Mary, the disciples, Joseph, like just all of these,
Joseph. Yeah.
they were teenagers. And so like, was this more of a cultural thing, or do you think there's significance to the notion of calling on the younger generation? And there's also the notion that, life expectancy probably wasn't nearly as high.
That was the first thing I was going to say. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the time, a fever would kill you. I mean, that's why so many of the Old Testament purity laws have to do with keeping you alive.
Sure.
Because of just their knowledge of medicine. And so, yeah, I mean, your life expectancy, I don't fact check me on this, but, it was probably in the 40s during this time. And so when you do see, because you're so right, you see all these depictions and they're usually sort of like elderly, kind of the elders of the church. And it's like, I don't know how many people there were in their 80s banging around at this time. And now if you go back to like the early Old Testament, I mean, people are hundreds of years old. So that's kind of a different part of all this. But yeah, you see, I don't know how old each of the disciples would have been. I assume several of them probably would have been on the younger side. But
yeah, I always heard from people who know a lot more than I do that you're talking anywhere between 14 and 17 years old was most likely where the majority of those 12 disciples were sitting at, and so that's what I have in my head.
Sure, well,
or at least when they started.
A lot of times we sort of envision God as this old man figure with the big beard in the sky, and a lot of times, I mean, we think of Jesus as this, full adult, obviously, but I mean, he was 30.
Yeah, so, I've already surpassed the age that Jesus made it to for his first bout of being alive, because he died theoretically around 33 years old. Yeah. So it's like, wow. And I remember when I was 33 just going, all right, well, I made it as long as Jesus did, so.
Yeah, so typically when you'll see women, a lot of time it's in the context of having children or getting married. And so that's true if you see Esther, Mary, and they, like most cultures throughout most of human history, they would follow biological kind of markers. And so when you would go through puberty, that was sort of the marker of now you're an adult. And so you see a lot of these rites of passage happening at that sort of early teenage years. And we still see this. I mean, you see in, bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs in the Jewish culture. I mean, they're not waiting until you're 25. In modern medicine, we know your brain's not done developing until you're 25, but you don't see those initiation rituals happening. I mean, in American society, we mark adulthood for the most part at 18 or 21 or 25, depending on if you need to rent a car, whatever level of adulthood you kind of have to get to. But universally, it's pretty much 18. You move out from your home and you start your own life. And so that's the line that we've drawn. In these cultures, it would have been much more tied to when you were biologically able to start having children. And so that for a lot of these young women is going to be in their early teens, far too young for what modern society would deem acceptable.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't put Nixon pace on some kind of crusade yet.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because there has been a conversation all throughout history about, rites of passage and coming of age stories and when does adulthood begin and what does that look like? And even today, I mean, we've seen in the last, 20 years, even just really a couple generations, the age of, beginning your career, getting married, having children, that's extended.
Yeah, it's changing.
Where even just in American culture, in the last 50 to 100 years, you would see, the norm is you would be getting married and start having kids in your early 20s, kind of right out of high school. College was not prevalent for a lot of people. And so you'd start working, maybe you join the military. A lot of people, went off to war and they were getting married before they did.
And so that's another great point is that these people were getting sent off to war. Right. So they're gone for 5 or 6 years. Right. If not longer, and then they come back and they are very different when they come back. And they're like an old 26 or something like that.
Very true. Well, and you can even see that today. I mean, if you see somebody, obviously you do a lot of maturing when you go to college, but if you have someone who goes to college and maybe they bounce around different majors and they're not really sure what they're going to do, and they kind of live a pretty comfortable, time in college, for someone who, maybe trains or goes to trade school and becomes like a welder or, a plumber right out of high school, and they are working. I mean, there's going to be a different kind of maturity that you experience, maybe a different kind of education you experience, but yeah, when you meet someone who's 25, not all 25-year-olds have the same level of life experience. And so
now I've met some 25-year-olds and I'm thinking they're close to my age. And I'm just like, whoa. Mm-hmm. And then I've met people my age that I thought were, 30. Mm-hmm. It just depends on a variety of different things, your upbringing, what you do for a living, and just how it ages you. And yeah, so I don't know. I just find that so interesting that so often in the Bible, God calls teenagers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's been a conversation, especially when you get into like children and youth ministry, something that I know a lot of times we will say is that, the youth are the future of the church. And every youth director I've known has a problem with that because they say the youth aren't the future. They're here now. They're leading now. They're going on mission trips. They're leading worship. They're doing a lot of this, in some cases more than many of our adult members, because we ask a lot of our youth. Yeah. We have leadership development. They're going on camps and mission trips and preaching. And absolutely. I mean, in 2 weeks, the youth are going to lead the music. They're going to preach. They're going to do a ton of stuff.
Kevin, comment down below how you feel about this.
But a lot of times you kind of get that pushback between like the legacy of the future and future generations versus empowering them now. And how do you make sure you are empowering young people? At the same time, how are you also making sure that you're mentoring and guiding and training and not giving too much to someone who's not ready yet? So,
we talked about that. Tough conversation. In the very first podcast that you were on was having healthy mentors. When you have that exuberant youthful energy and then having a mentor to help kind of aim that energy and try to guide it, but mostly just aim it, because that's a kind of energy that's hard to contain. And the thing is, you shouldn't want to contain it. You should just want to kind of make it sure it lands somewhere in the right area.
But someone's got to help you kind of sand off the rough edges if you're a little over eager, which...
Well, I think some of that just naturally happens while you're aging. Like some people, you're not gonna shut them down. You just have to put that energy somewhere. So hopefully it's somewhere constructive. Because I think I was one of those. Like, you're either going to be in my way and I'll end up running into you a bunch until you fire me because you're mad at me, or you aim me in a slightly different direction and hopefully it benefits everybody. Yeah. And I've had both. And
well, on this stuff, so I'm curious to know what you think about this, because yesterday in the sermon I talked a lot about how Esther, God's not mentioned in Esther. Right. And we've kind of talked, even though this series isn't like directly about calling. I mean, as we're being introduced to these characters, a lot of the things we're seeing are their kind of calls to ministry. Yeah. And so you work in ministry, have for many years, and I've talked about my call story in different ways, but how did you experience that? And how do you feel about this conversation of how do you know when something really is from God? How do you know when it's something you just want to do?
Look at my last question. So he just cheated and stole the words from
I never get to ask the question, so I wanted to jump in.
It is the perfect question, because you were talking about that again yesterday. And so I knew when I started working at Glen Lake Camp when I was in college. So this was in 2006 when I started working at Glen Lake. And when I was there, I just felt for the first time like everything I was supposed to do felt obvious, and I felt like it was I was in tune with it, if that makes sense. Like I was vibrating on the same wavelength as everything around me in that setting, where we are trying to inspire different age groups of kids, and not everybody is inspired by the same thing. Some people are inspired by what you do, where you're bringing intellectual and emotional and storytelling, and then putting it all into roughly 20 minutes of just speaking content. Or what I do is I try to tap into this emotional thing that taps into your heart and taps into your enjoyment and taps into the emotions that you often can only express through music. As I've said many times, music is the purest language of emotion. And so because like you can often not describe how you're feeling, but you could say, well, listen to this song and that'll tell you how I feel. And so we all do these different things, but virtually all of the things that we do in a church setting, on some level, I get that and I resonate with that and I feel that vibration, and I say, yes, I can contribute positively to that. It's one of the only things that I've ever done in my life that I just pretty much, I'm like, yes, I know, I get what we're doing here, and I feel like I'm part of it and I can add to it rather than distract from it.
I've had some of those experiences, and to me, that's when it's the clearest. And I feel like I've started to articulate that as a confirmation of a call where I'm doing something and I feel like God is confirming like this is what you should be doing. The part that I struggle with is when God is calling me to do something that I'm not actively participating in or I'm not actively doing it. Because you're so right. When you're doing something and it just feels right and it just fits. But sometimes God calls us to do something we haven't done yet. And that's the part that's hard for me because I'm a very future-oriented person. So I love to think about hypotheticals and the future and goals and where are we going? And what are we going to do? And what are our kids going to be like? And what are we going to just everything about the future? But I have a hard time delineating, is this something I want to do? Is this something God wants me to do? Because sometimes those are the same.
Yeah.
Sometimes, though, they're not. I remember when I was in seminary, there was I forget, we were in some sort of like... we used to call it seminary homeroom, but it was kind of a class that you would be in, kind of like a homeroom class all throughout all 3 years where you got to build relationships and you talked about career development and vocational discernment and your call and all the things that are kind of implicit in a seminary journey for most people, but not discussed really openly. And so in there, we were talking about what do you want to do with your degree? Because we had people there who wanted to be professors. A lot of people wanted to be pastors. Some people were in a music program, Master of Sacred Music. Some were just there because they wanted to know if God was real. And the mechanism that they used to explore their faith was seminary, which I thought that is an expensive choice to explore your faith. But, I mean, it's also an experience. So, and they got a degree. But out of that, a lot of people would say, I struggle. The better my call feels for me, the more I question it. We were like, what do you mean? They're like, well, if I say that I really feel called to pastor big, healthy, rich churches where I'm going to make a lot of money and get to stand up in front of thousands of people, and I'm going to have this big platform and things are going to go on all this staff to help do stuff. And like, do I just want those things? Like, do I just want to be famous? Do I just want to have a big audience? Do I just want to be paid more money? Like, the better it goes for me personally. Because when you look in scripture, when God asks people to do things, it's usually doesn't work out super well for them. It's usually go do this really hard thing. Jonah, go to Nineveh. Esther, risk your life. Moses, go back to Egypt. Like, go to the last place you want to go to. It's usually a hard thing that's not like, hey, go to this cushy job where you're going to, kind of get to cruise. That's usually not the calling. And so that really stuck out to me because I had a mentor, you have to do internships in seminary, and one of them I did was with a second-generation Korean church plant. But the second one I did,
Interesting.
The second one I did was with a church called. I forget what it was called. I think it was just First Humboldt Park. Humboldt Park's a neighborhood in West Chicago, and it's a historically Puerto Rican neighborhood. We'll have to talk about this one day because I learned about the origin of the Latin King gang and like Puerto Rican culture, and it was phenomenal. But all to say, the pastor of the church, his name was Ramon Nieves, and he was a former lawyer, and he was like a super wealthy, high-powered corporate litigator, I think, in Chicago, but he felt this calling, and so he left like a 7-figure income to go to seminary. He had like a JD MBA, and he was pastoring this tiny church. I mean, he had to have like conference subsidy funds to afford his salary, and so nobody questioned his call. And like my preaching professor, she used to be a trader on Wall Street, and she was making 7 figures, and then she felt this call, and then she came and got her PhD in worship, and now she teaches preaching at the seminary. And so for people like that, when you have incredible power and wealth, if you leave that to do something for God, no one questions your call.
Sure.
But if you feel called to go do something that's going to give you a lot of great perks, you start to wonder, like, well, is this just what I want to do, or is this what God wants me to do?
I feel called to be a big platinum movie star.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
I really feel called to be a famous worship leader. I just see my name in lights, and that would be a little suspect if that's what you stood up on Sunday morning and you're like, Creekwood, I really feel like God is calling me to be the next elevation. We're gonna be Hillsong in here. That would be a little suspect. But how do you deal with that? Like, how do you discern? When it's not, you feel confirmed in the moment. When you're thinking about where God is leading you in the future, how do you figure that out? And how do you discern that?
Well, that was my question for you.
Sucker.
For me, it was when I was more concerned about them. Whoever them is.
That's a good way to put it.
I was more concerned about them.
Yeah.
I was not concerned about my image, how I looked. I was not concerned about how good I was singing, which is a weird thing for me to say because I've worked so hard for so many years crafting my ability to sing really well, so as not to distract by singing all the wrong notes. But when I was focused solely on, I want you to feel what I'm feeling. And because that's the beauty of my job as somebody who I get to, like, one of the things I'm doing shortly after this is I'm working on a new song that we're going to be adding in worship in a few weeks.
You're writing it?
And no, not writing it. I've only written a couple of worship songs, and I don't think they're that good. But
It's a whole different skill set.
it really is.
That's
and
not one I
songs
have.
that I've written before are not worship songs.
Songs I've written before are garbage.
They're like bluesy rock songs. But anyway, and so I'm working on this because the first time I heard this worship song, I was just like, what is happening? Like you feel something in your chest, and you're like, okay, I want everybody at Creekwood to feel this feeling. And that is one of my favorite parts of my job is I get to explore and spend a lot of time looking for these moments where I feel something strong, something compelling, something real in my chest. And then I'm like, okay, now it's my job to somehow make sure that you can feel what I felt on a Sunday morning. Because you spend a fraction of your week doing what I spend a lot of my week doing.
Yeah.
And so that's the big part of that. And so when my goal is to worry about them and connect them to God, that's when I know that it's God's calling and not my own vanity, not my own selfish wants.
That's well put. At
At least
I like that. No, I like that. And I've probably thought that at times as well, but I don't know that I thought of it like that. So I appreciate you saying it that way. I think for me, I've struggled with this because I love to preach and I've always wanted to work in larger churches.
Well, you have all these advantages. You
Well,
don't have to
you
worry
do.
about things like sound, or at least, until we get your EQ fixed. You don't have to worry, but you don't have to worry about whether the lighting's not good until we get our lighting fixed. And, so you just get to focus on the content and
you get to
the
specialize
delivery
more.
Yeah, and instead of having to jump hurdles to get to the point because there's all these distractions and everything.
Yeah, and it's tough because I've worked in a lot of smaller churches or church plants where you kind of have to be a jack of all trades and do a bunch of different things. You don't really get to specialize as much.
Grace Chapel was a church plant, right?
Yeah, and so out of that, I always felt self-conscious, I guess, or I was second guessing myself all the time because I would talk to mentors and I would say, how do you balance ambition with your call to ministry? Which we should talk about that one day. Because I was like, I have all these goals. I have all this ambition. I want to grow my career. I want to grow the church, but I don't know where my call stops and my ego begins. And so I would sit there with mentors and I would say, I feel called to like larger systems. Is that just vanity? And they said, first of all, maybe, which was good for me to hear. But also they said, one, we have churches of all size and they all need leaders. Yes. And what you'll find out is you probably think, this is a mentor telling me early in my career, you probably think everybody wants to run a big church. And I was like, well, of course. And they said, I don't know hardly any pastors who want to run a big church because you have to deal. This was a pastor of a big church. He's like, very little of what I do feels like pastoral ministry. There's so much business and logistics and conflict and money and everything that goes into helping to keep a large system running that you have to have that skill set and you have to want to do that work. And a lot of people don't. And so one, don't think that everybody wants to do this. That's not true. And you have to look at what your gifts are. God has given you gifts. And God wants you to use your gifts in ways that can benefit the kingdom. And so I began to look at that and say, okay, I used to look at what I felt I was gifted at as strengths and weaknesses. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm good at this, or I like this, and I really wish I was better at this. And it was always this regret, like, I wish I was better at these parts of my job, or I wish I enjoyed doing this more, or I wish I didn't love this part so much because I don't really get to do much about that. Well, that's because I was working in a very small church plant where there were no systems. And so now coming into a system like Creekwood and other, churches I've worked in and different activities I've been involved in that were more systems based, I've realized I felt that regret or that unfulfillment because in that moment, called for such a time as this, like those skills weren't relevant to what I was doing at the time. It doesn't mean that God wasn't going to use those skills at some point in my life.
Well, you're building something, and then later on it comes in handy, and you're like, oh man, I'm so glad I have this skill now. I hated having to learn it, but now it's just like, oh, I got this.
Yeah. Well, and coming back to the point of having good mentors is they said, you may really want to do this work, but that'll change as you get more experience because you're not ready to do it yet. And at the time, of course, I was like, whatever, I could do anything. And I'm so thankful that I didn't because something else I would love for us to do an episode on are all these like church scandal podcasts and documentaries that have gone around recently.
Oh my gosh, like the rise and fall of Mars Hill.
It's my favorite one.
It's so good. It's
I love it. But out of it, there's a line that's come up in a lot of these documentaries called that goes something along the lines of these pastors' charisma outpace their character because a lot of times they're younger and they're super charismatic. They get a lot of success, a lot of fame. They end up having to make huge decisions with not a lot of experience or training or mentors or accountability.
That ego to come in and really take over. Like, Carl Lentz up in New York for the Hillsong New York, and he's having lunch with Justin Bieber and people. It's and how do you avoid?
How could you?
It's impossible.
If you don't have accountability, it's why our system can be very overbearing at times, but also it helps to create a hedge against some of this. So that's one of the things that looking back now, I'm so thankful that I did not get an appointment the size of Creekwood early in my career because I would not have known what to do and I would have been a mess because I wouldn't have managed people. I wouldn't have known how to, all the mistakes that I made when the stakes were lower in smaller churches. To have mentors there to say, okay, you fell flat on your face.
There's a lot of humbling moments you need.
What did you learn and how can we do this better? And so in the midst of that, I feel like it's something that, like with all things, your call becomes clear over time. And I think if you try to keep asking the right questions, what does this do for other people? Like you talked about, how can I make sure I'm focusing on whoever the them is in this conversation, the way you put it, and not make it about me? And how can I lean back on my own experience and learn from that and really try to remember, okay, when were those moments I felt like God had confirmed my call? What are my gifts? And how can I put them to use in a way that serves God and not really necessarily serves me first? And sometimes there are benefits and perks from your job, and that's okay.
I think
it's, sometimes you feel guilty, but it's like
down every day.
You should enjoy your job. You should enjoy what you do. And so at the end of the day, it is funny to try to kind of navigate all that. But it's harder. I mean, the more successful you are and the longer you work in things, it is both easier to remain humble because you've got the experience and the wisdom, but sometimes it's also harder because the more you succeed or the more power you get or the more authority you get, the less you have people, teaching you lessons and holding you accountable and the less mentors you have. And you can start to think that you're just awesome because everyone's too afraid to tell you that you're really in the dirt. And
you're not being challenged in any way, shape, or form. And you got really lucky and just landed in a job that doesn't challenge you at all because you have a staff of 30 people that does all the stuff that you're bad at somehow. And you just landed in the perfect place.
You show up and preach on Sunday. You show up and sing the songs and that's all you do. Yeah, it's really tough.
That would be wild.
But I think it's also good, like having the right role model. So we talked about Esther on Sunday about how she's a great role model for courage. But to me, that's the end of what I can take from Esther as a role model because we only see a very tiny snippet of her life. And so I always wonder, what did people go on to do? What did Esther do after this? Did she take on a leadership role with the Hebrew people? I don't know. I mean, it seems like her role as queen was largely ceremonial. And so a lot of times someone will do something great, and you see a lot of this in these scandal, documentaries, but someone will do something great, or they'll give an incredible sermon, or in today's language. They'd give an amazing TED talk, or they'd write one great book, and we think they're an incredible novelist, but they just had one good idea, and they don't have a lot of range. Or an actor delivers an incredible performance, and it's not that they're necessarily a great actor with range. It's that
they just landed
who
the perfect
they
role.
are was perfect for that character, and they were just themselves. And so I think that's also, it's important to just kind of take a step back in moments like this and say, what do we learn from Esther? Courage. And the courage and the faith to say yes.
Yeah.
But that's kind of it for this moment. Like, let's not, blow this out of proportion. And so I think it's important to look around when we're having this. And this is a great example for this Sunday. We're talking about David. And there are so many beautiful things that David did and so many incredible things that you want to follow. But you know where I'm going. There's a lot that David did that you don't want to follow.
That's absolutely true.
When people say, like, David was a man after God's own heart, and a lot of times you read the stories and you're like, really?
David
like,
also killed Bathsheba's husband intentionally because he just wanted to sleep with her.
David does. So it is important. We're talking about scriptural David too, not David Lesnar. But
don't get that confused.
I think it's important that you have to look at the whole story and you have to be thinking about that, because it's easy. We've seen it time and time again where someone does something quick, they get a lot of accolades, and everybody thinks they're as good at everything as they are at that thing.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
And then you feel like you have to be.
Oh,
and you can't ask for help because you're supposed to be the leader.
Charismatic leaders, Jim Jones kind of thing. We're just like, well, they can do no wrong.
Right. Yeah. And you start to deify them, and then it's not a good path.
Well, man, you've kind of set up like the next 5 or 6 podcasts. You have all these things. You're like, oh, we got to do a podcast. Oh, we got to do it. And you're absolutely right.
About it.
I would love to do podcasts on all of those things.
As we've been having these conversations, every time I'll hear something or think of something, I'm like, I gotta talk to John. We gotta do a podcast about that. Is that even what the podcast is? Maybe I gotta write a sermon about this so we can make a podcast about it. But anyway, I'm thinking about it.
I want to close with this because I gotta believe on some level it's what the people want to hear about: the ocean. He almost just spit out his water.
Yeah, so
that was one of my favorite ocean rants I've ever heard, and I've heard quite a few, and that was fantastic. So where does this stem from?
Well, primarily it stems from, I think it's fun to have fun in church. And as we were going through preaching classes, I heard one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard about being a good preacher is watch stand-up comedy. Because a lot of times people have incredible content, but their delivery's tough or their timing's bad, or they try to tell jokes instead of having a sense of humor. And I think there's a difference in those two things. And so part of that is just I'm a big fan of stand-up comedy. And so sometimes I slip into it without thinking about it.
Because that all the great stand-up comedians, everything they say is based in truth.
Sure.
And it's not just joke setup knock knock kind of thing. These are, you get it to that rhythm, and so 100% makes sense with your ability to express your disdain for going anywhere near the ocean, or much less or in the ocean.
I mean, all to say, that was way overblown. I mean, I don't really have this crippling fear of the ocean. I definitely don't like it. I discovered, so the fear of the open ocean is called thalassophobia, and I only know that because this has existed, or I've said it out loud too many times, or on my phone that's listening to us. But there are these YouTube videos that'll pop up suggested for me sometime where it's like, do you have thalassophobia? And it starts showing you videos. And it's like, if this freaks you out, then you have this fear.
And of course, you're
oh my gosh, terrified. Horrifying. And so anyway, but it's mostly that you're underwater and you can see nothing, or it just goes on forever, kind of the abyss. And a lot of it's, if you have a fear of open spaces or whatever, it's very similar to that. But no, I mean, for the most part, and I always have to remember that in sermons, in a comedy show, people know you're joking, but in sermons, I mean, sometimes people will take something, I don't want to say too seriously, but they won't necessarily know you're joking or whatever. And so I've had to try to, reel it in sometimes. And I haven't gone back to watch the video of it yesterday, but after church.
It's currently uploading.
Exactly. After church, that was the number one thing that I got comments about, were all these people who were like, I love scuba diving. And I was like, I love that for you. And, it's beautiful, and so many people were like, it's God's aquarium and it's so gorgeous and so peaceful. And I'm like, yeah.
I've never heard it called God's aquarium.
Yeah, Julie Stilley told me that. And I love that. Well, so she was talking about that, and I forget his name. There was somebody standing there too, and she was like, it's so peaceful. And he goes, yeah, until it's not. And I was like, yes. So anyway, it's like vindication. But it was all to say, I was just trying to be silly. And it's one thing that I also have whenever I preach is this memory of being a kid and being a teenager in church when I was asleep during the sermon because it was so boring, or the stories were only about fishing with your grandchildren from the perspective of a grandfather. And I was like, I don't care about any of this. And so
it's like you're
sometimes
speaking my language right now.
Yeah. So sometimes I try to be extra silly or overblow something to try to make sure I'm, entertaining enough for people to, stay engaged. And it's fun to jump around for, the kids like that and teenagers like that. And I like that. I'm a silly person. So I think it's fun for all that. But no, it was mostly just as a joke, but it is, like you said, absolutely based in truth. I have a mutual and a healthy fear of the ocean, and I'm sure I will go scuba diving one day. I have a thing about trying to face my fears. If I have a fear, like I want to face it. And it has helped. I used to have a big fear of spiders, and growing up in Arizona, that doesn't fly very far because the spiders are massive.
They're everywhere. And
so I did the whole let the tarantula crawl on your hand thing and kind of get over it. So I try to face my fears when I can. So I'm sure this is not a request for someone to take me scuba diving right now. I'll get there one day.
Or bring him a giant spider.
But no, I think that it's something that it is definitely rooted in truth. But, I was just trying to be silly and
love it.
Get people to laugh.
All right. So when you have your scuba diving trip, just ask him for advice. The advice is
don't
go somewhere else.
Don't do it.
Well, we have a lot of good podcasts in the future because we've mapped out about a dozen of them today. So thanks for hanging out with us. And Sunday Plus today was episode 29.
Oh,
the big 3-0 next week. So thanks for hanging out with us. Catch you in the next one.
See y'all.